Cool. All right, we're going to continue doing this line writers image. So I haven't worked on it since we had our last stream. And the main objective for today is probably just to get the background happening and then just do a check to see what do we got to do before we go to the final finished line stage. So that's really what we've got planned today. Probably be going for about an hour and a half or something like that. So yeah, let me know if you have any questions or other things, and we'll sort of get to that and can chat about drawing. But yeah, mostly what I'm focusing on here is that background, sorting out that background. And again, the main decision is, do I try and do something fancy with it, or do I kind of leave it like it is? Is it good enough as it is? That's my main concern. I think previously we were really, sort of fussing over this character here and trying to get them working. And I don't think I was like 100% happy with that. I think that was something that was, a major sort of work in progress. And again, what I do to sort of fix that is just go in there and maybe construct it out a little bit more. So think more carefully about where the hair is, what direction it's going to be flowing. Yeah, basic stuff like that. So these girls seem to have like really sort of basic fantasy hair. I think a lot of that fantasy hair is based on the kind of 70s middle part, like that sort of basic hairstyle, and maybe some sort of idea that you don't have like a GHD in medieval times, although that doesn't seem to hold up to common wisdom. Common wisdom is that you can have GHD curls in Game of Thrones, but again, it all just depends how much realism you want to put in there. So just playing around. To me, it was mostly the hair, but you can see here if we track that center line, that probably we can move this eye a little bit that way. And again, we'll probably flip it at some point and double check. This is a good situation where, again, if I did step up in detail and I got a smaller brush, I'd probably be like thinking, awesome, now I can get more detail in there. Now this is working well. But again, overall, if we consider the overall goal, I think that would be something where once you zoom out and look at the image overall, that will just get fiddly. So you have to stick to your guns in terms of figuring out how much detail to put in and when to put it in and that sort of thing. And again, I'm using this brush type because it's a good sense of making sure everything has the same level of detail. So again, just playing around with that hair. Because I want it to be detailed, but not to still be stylized. And I guess that's the difference is, if we start adding nuance to a lot of these shapes, then it starts to feel less kind of simplified and stylized. Yeah, thinking about like, where does this character look? I think that's kind of critical. They were looking maybe in a bit of a boring position. See if it's like this versus like this. Yeah, I feel like everything kind of going this way is probably better. And I'm just going to move this nose a little bit more to the on center. Yeah, so I feel like that's working a little bit better already. Now again, this character is not quite finished, but I feel like the bones of it are there. Most of it is working. I think the main thing is to refine some of the anatomy and make sure, you know, this hand is going to be pretty prominent. So just make sure all of those things are kind of working, but that's something that I need to do a bit later on. I think for now, the main job is this background here. Now I am going to make this on a separate layer, or at least do that to begin with, so that it just becomes clear that, you know, I can erase it, or, you know, not worry about it interacting too much in a weird way. And I think to me, it just feels like these things need a little bit more character. So we've got some of that perspective there. I'm just going to play with some basic shape design to see if we can make it look more interesting and just add some extra bits and pieces to it. And yeah, this bit will be, I guess, a little bit formulaic. So where's the, let me check this perspective. We sort of had a secondary vanishing point for some of these things. It looked like sort of some of these were coming from here still. So a bit confusing in terms of where everything is going, because I think this one was sort of at a slightly different angle. That was a big part of what was making this interesting. So let's see if we can sort that out. Again, when we're sketching, there's not a huge need for that to be, you know, hyper accurate. When we're doing this, probably need to be a little bit more accountable to where all that stuff is. So this, again, just sort of figuring it out. And none of this is stuff that would hold up to, you know, like proper grid in boot camp. We're just guesstimating these things. But the basic idea is we're going to have some buildings here that are going to be in the same alignment as the sort of foreground, right? So you can see the foreground has its vanishing point here. And the entrance, right? So the initial things that are in the foreground are going to follow that, right? So these things are going to have that same vanishing point, whereas these others are going to be same horizon line, obviously, but going from this vanishing point here, and again, there's a vanishing point sort of somewhere, right? Somewhere off here. So we're gonna just see if we can grid some of that out. give ourselves some structure. And this is mainly just so, stuff doesn't go completely pear-shaped. As long as it doesn't go completely pear-shaped, we're going to be okay. So let's put in some verticals just around the place. That will kind of keep us a little bit honest. So that's the vanishing point for this. Now we have like a quasi 1 point here. So again, these foreground buildings are gridded out a little bit differently. It's just basic perspective, guys. Just basic perspective. So just trying to find some shared common design language to link up these foreground and background buildings. Again, stick with the grids. So it's all about scale, right? Just sort of making sure we have some little bits and pieces for that silhouette. Bang. So just tracing. Thinking about where those eaves are going to be. Again, this is pretty focal. So, I am going to try and at least suggest some of these things. I'm not actually going to draw heaps of it. It's going to be all suggested, but we will try and make sure it all lines up. Again, it's all just illusion of detail, right? Some little windows, give everything scale. And again, a big part of it is like trying to set that level of detail somewhere. So set it with the focal area, and then we can work back from that and say, okay, well, nothing else needs quite that level of fussing. But at least now we know that's kind of where we should aim for focal areas, right? For primary read. And the reason for that is I'm setting that level of detail relative to the other sort of hierarchy of detail elements that are in the image. And look, the primary thing we're saying here is that this is not a European medieval town, right? So it's not a fantasy based on that. It feels more exotic to the typical sort of Western viewer. So thinking about there being some stuff here. And this is where we just have to think about, different areas that might be in a big sort of castle like this. Why would they be there? What would you want? What would be fun for you to see? Trace that baseline there. Go along here. Put in a few more little window things. So what I'm after to a certain degree is also interesting shapes on these edges, right? So again, I've got these sort of interesting shapes here. That's going to create an interesting silhouette. I don't have anything here, but it could be good to kind of just keep this clean. Maybe I'll think about that, just because it's going to have a nice amount of relief to it. But we could also try just putting a few little tiles or roof elements to it to show the different levels of, let's make sure that goes to that vanishing point. Yeah, different levels of the building maybe. Again, not sure. The idea is obviously that eventually it's gonna get bigger. So just carving shapes, trying to think about what's interesting. A lot of this is just experimentation. If it doesn't work, it gets deleted. Again, vertical, vertical. Let's make sure that lines up, vertical, vertical. And of course here, we have another roof bit. Maybe again, starting to create way overly complicated shapes, but it's okay. Just keep drawing through. See what happens. Again, half the time these things are, I just mess around and spend a bunch of time and then I just delete it all because I'm like, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't look like a castle. And most of this stuff no one's ever going to see, right? It's not going to be that interesting, but hopefully there's a few bits and pieces in there that people find a little bit entertaining. And I have no idea what's going on with these hanging discs. Was there an inspiration? No, it's me just kind of doodling around, and as I'm doing it, I'm kind of thinking and seeing what happens. So it's not like design where we start with inspiration. It's a little bit more, like we're just kind of making it up as we go along. But, I do have a few things that I was, that I have sort of done in the past, right? And probably I have proclivities, in terms of things that I think are interesting, that you might have sort of seen in some of the other ones, right? So if we look at the previous, if I can get the previous one, see if I can search for that for a sec while we do this. open with. There we go. So you can see again, there's like similar kind of non-Western fantasy kind of elements in this one. You know, so it's a similar kind of idea. But yeah, just trying to make it look a little bit fancier. Just thinking again, like how much fancier can I make it? It's getting some weird sort of tangents up there. Might try and do some of that sort of elsewhere. Yeah, so again, and most of that is going to be kind of cut off. So we sort of had yes, if we think about this being like the bottom of it, and so if there's like a little person, right, like that's going to how big, actually it has to be smaller, right? Person's going to be just a tiny little, right, tiny little dot over there. So I'm just thinking about how this might work, because we had these arches, and I kind of wanted to make the arch part of it in the background. So I'm kind of thinking about how to do that. Again, there's not a lot of reason for this type of thing. But yeah, maybe there's like a little bridge over here. So yeah, again, to answer your question, Lewis, who's just saying, was there an inspiration for the big fantasy town that you're drawing? No, I'm kind of just making up stuff. And this is exactly how I'm doing it, where I'm just sort of thinking like, if I was walking around over here, if I was like this pixel here, what would I see? You know, where would I be walking? How big is this thing? What would be fun? What would be challenging? Right? And as I do that, we sort of build stuff, little things. I'm like, well, maybe this is like a bridge, you know, this is the big sort of entrance. Maybe on this sort of right arm of this big thing, right? We sort of got like another little wall. Maybe again, there's like a tower over here or something. So again, I'm kind of changing the perspective around because I want it to feel a little bit more organic, right? Again, imagine a person's that big. So there's little people on these walls. That's sort of how big they are. And I guess it sort of becomes like a bit part of that wall. And hey, Miblet, how you going? Yeah, so you know, working on your perspective is this is sort of for my 2 cents. This is exactly why you want to work on your perspective. To address Lewis's point, because the more you kind of figure that stuff out, the more you can just kind of doodle around. And because I sort of know where the grid is, it's very easy for me to be like, well, yeah, this isn't on that grid, but it's relative to the horizon line. It'll feel consistent. And yeah, I'm not worrying too much about, sort of, I'm not being constrained by the terror of, is this going to look like it's in 3 dimensions? And that's just because I'm just applying basic perspective theory. I've done a lot of practice with this stuff. And the number one rule that I'm really following is just consistency is king. That is my number one rule with perspective. If I make sure that these sort of things are, consistent or feel consistent, then most things will be forgiven. And it doesn't have to be, the most accurate thing in the world. So again, thinking we've sort of got some rocks here. And I'm going to try and work with that parallax. And the parallax and, just getting the depth, right? So overlapping shapes. It's a primary sort of part of getting all this working. I don't know what those shapes will be yet. I'm just drawing on one layer. But, I know sort of for sure now that there'll probably be like one layer here, right? That'll be the foreground. It'll be all this stuff, and maybe like some stuff in here, maybe this thing. And then all of these buildings will be sort of one. Maybe you'll have another layer here, another layer there. And then these things will probably be on a separate layer behind. And that'll be a huge fuss to kind of draw all that on different layers. And then we've got to sort of flat it out. But it'll be very, very easy in the end to adjust the image from a compositional standpoint, make sure it's sort of all looking right. So again, just thinking, and you got to remember as well, the idea is that some of this has sort of fallen down. Some of it has been abandoned, and so we want to kind of tell those stories, give us some other sort of overlapping forms to play with, and that'll help us tell that story as well. So just making sure I at least do, like a half decent job of constructing this arch there. Probably if we were to trace it back, it's going to be like that. Yeah, and then we'll try and make it interesting, because that doesn't look interesting. Maybe we'll try and, again, maybe there'll be some different sides to the bridge. Do some stuff here, maybe a few things that might have had flags on them or something like that over there. Again, let's have another one of these hanging pendants. Doesn't make any sense, but it sort of looks cool. Yeah, so I remember, I often tell this story. I remember going to France, and I'd done my first book, and the guy who'd storyboarded the book was called Jerome Lecully, and he's had been working, I think, for quite a while as a French comic book artist. I just remember I think he'd done drawing teaching it well, but he said, Tim, when you draw the house, you have to think of the person who lives in the house. And I was like, that's so fucking true. And that's just stuck with me forever. And so that's the best way I explain it, is I'm just sitting there just thinking about, like, what are these things for? Who would live in them? Where would they walk around? What stuff would they leave about? What would they need? Who would build it? Sometimes, it might get built and then someone's like, hey, this architecture sucks. You need to build a thing over here, and then that would get built, and then something else would get built. So it'll get functionality at some point. I guess that's the whole idea. Yeah, so that's a terrible way of explaining what I'm doing, Lewis, but that's the truth. Just making up nonsense and thinking about it. And again, the solution, like it's not going to be a design that is good enough that I would probably be comfortable using it as a design. Like it's functioning for this purpose. So yeah, it's not there to be like, look at my design that's ready to go straight into a animation. It's not me doing design. This is illustration, and it's sort of, I am doing design on the fly. But if someone was like, what's this? What's going on here? I just sort of say, I don't know. Let's actually design it and figure it out. All right, so now I'm going to here. I need to remember this building, I think, or is this? No, maybe these ones are sort of still on this grid. I've got to figure that out. Yeah, I think they're still on that grid. So go, boom. Boom. Exactly. It's calculated nonsense. Yeah, but the difference is I know it's nonsense, and I'm comfortable with the degree of nonsense, so I'm not getting freaked out. So I guess that's the difference. Is the goal is to have something that's sort of interesting and serves the purpose. But I mean, the difference is, I guess, that the way I'd explain it is, if we were thinking about designing it for a function, and so that you actually got up there and it made sense, you probably wouldn't put all these things in exactly these positions. They probably have a functional hierarchy that outweighed where they are here. Whereas in this case, I'm just placing everything so that it sort of relates to the composition, if that makes sense. Yeah, and so it just gives you a particular bias. Yeah, I guess it's kind of like the Disney castle, right? The Disney castle looks good from one angle. I mean, they probably figured it out, right? But at some point, that's just a big castle that works from one angle, and it's meant to be like, look at this cool fantasy world you're about to enter. No one's sitting there being like, did they ever actually make castles like that? How are those crenellations formatted? What's going on here? They just kind of make it look cool. But the way that I do that is to think about who would have lived there and what they're doing, and that's sort of what goes on in my head as I'm drawing that. All right. So again, I don't need to draw that because we've got this one going on in front of it. And to a certain degree, that some element of this doesn't make sense, this is a bit weird, is okay, because we kind of want it not to always make sense. If people are kind of sitting at it, looking at it sideways, then that can be interesting. And I think that's one of the interesting things about those big fantasy castles that are all fake, right? Because most of the castles that look like the Disney castle are just nonsense. They're just created by, it's like mansions in California or something like that. It's just the pathetic delusions of lonely rich people trying to impress other lonely rich people. but you wouldn't really want to live there. It'd be really annoying. All right. So again, just thinking about scale, this is where I have to, be a little bit more conscious. Yeah, if we've sort of got these things here, like how big are these windows? Like, I think I need to make them a little bit, right, a little bit smaller. So again, they feel like they're bigger than these ones, but not that much bigger. All right. The same thing here. A bit smaller. And again, I don't know who lives in here or would want to live in here or why they built it to be that shape. It doesn't seem like that would make much sense. So again, we've got people would probably be this big over here. And see if we can kind of cover up some of these connection points with some foliage. Again, have some, maybe show some of this stuff cracking. Trees growing out of it. Again, we can have some trees on top here. Show it to be a little bit broken or something. People might just think it's like a cool tree house. Maybe it's just, it would be good to have trees in your castle tower thing. From a Disney castle standpoint, probably not from a structural, architectural standpoint. And again, it's trying to set that scale, right? Thinking about, if this is as big as a person, how big are we likely to get? How big are we going to see different elements of this foliage? Like how much detail is going to be there? How much detail is going to be too much? Again, keep in mind it's got to be a really large image, so I want to sort of keep it a little bit big, but not so big that it interferes with other stuff. So that really is the goal, right? It needs to be big and detailed, but we need to be able to compare it to the other sort of focal areas, and it doesn't, it needs to not get in the way. So I'm mostly just after silhouette pop, because I feel like this will be on a separate layer to this behind it, right? So if we can get some interesting shapes going there, I think that'll help. And again, that's why I'm sort of designing this as an interesting silhouette, because it'll probably be a part of the depth. And as we said in previous weeks, one of the main things that we can do to kind of show this is overgrown is to kind of show that the doorways are blocked. All right. Now, we also had a bit behind here that would be part of this one. Let's make sure, watch the tangents. The more we put in there, the trickier it becomes to maintain good tangents everywhere, because we start to get a little bit messy. So just making sure that these shapes that we're creating are not going to interfere with the other shapes we've already created. And that's why, again, to a certain degree, you can design this out as much as you want. You could maybe build this in 3D, but the thing that's going to make a one-off illustration like this interesting is just if we sort of optimize the shape design as much as possible. And it's often actually very hard to do that with 3D, because you'll find it very hard to match up all those silhouettes in an interesting, effective way. Now, part of me is kind of like, do we want that there in the beginning? Maybe let's try get rid of that and think about the structure. So here we've got the structure here. Maybe it would be better to kind of continue this structure. Right, because this line, right, matches up nicely. Let's carry that across. We want that up right there. And again, let's see if we can follow through there. So the more we can kind of try and link up some of this structure with other bits, I think the easier it will be. Something like this. Manage that overlap by creating some foliage, maybe even some foliage here to sort of push that back even further. Put a few of those little windows in there. So yeah, to me, again, that starts to look a little bit more interesting, because we've got got some of this structure kind of coming across. Yeah, I really have to remember how I sort of designed and worked out this, like what was going on with this roof, because that's going to be a total nightmare to try and figure out if I forget it. Like I had an idea in my head, and I'm kind of putting these are almost like little notes, right? Like, oh yeah, like this could go here and that could go there. But yeah, very easy to just kind of forget all that and be stuck inking it, going, who drew this nonsense? This is no longer calculated nonsense. This is just nonsense. All right. Yeah, cool. And again, I like the idea that sort of, again, we start to blend out to kind of foliage at some point. So we zoom out, have a look. And this kind of does fry your brain a bit. I'm a bit like, I'm really sick of drawing those buildings now. So let's think about what we had here. Right, we sort of had this terracing. Again, thinking primarily about, let's rotate so I can get a bit of a better line there. All right, thinking about the intersection of the character and everything, that's going to influence where I put this line. And the idea here is pretty simple. We've just got, they sort of go down onto a terrace and then down onto a second terrace. So let's try and make sure that structurally makes sense. Just putting some trees there. And again, if we try and make it feel like it was at some point structured, that might help. So transfer these trees over, right? Thinking about it, you know, maybe in the past it was this big fancy walkway. Right, you sort of approached, because if you go to, you know, places like Versailles or, you know, any of those big sort of palaces, again, where, you know, very depressed, rich, powerful people engaged in megalomania. Yeah, they were always really into that stuff, you know, that sense of, look at me, you are looking out onto this vista, and it's very impressive, and you should be very, very impressed. Yeah, so again, just telling that depth story as well. Right. So some standard train track perspective stuff. I probably should measure the distance there. I'm not really doing that. That would tell the distance story even better. Yeah. Of course, the idea is that sort of path there will kind of lead through there. Trees in the background might be good. Again, I'm like, can I have some trees going behind there? That might really help. Again, anything that will help sell the distance, I'm going to do. So I'm going to imagine maybe there's like a big tree behind here, and it goes behind this bridge. And you can kind of see it there. Again, that stuff seems like, oh yeah, does that matter? That stuff makes all the difference. Those little subtle cues. It'll make it feel like, again, there's just a lot of sort of overlap and interesting depth going on. It's often those, again, as long as we put them in the right spot, yeah, those things will really, really help. Yeah, cool. And again, as I keep saying, right, this is all sort of overgrown. So it's as if we have somewhere like Versailles, but it's all collapsed and messy and stuff. So I'm still going to try and leave plenty of breathing room around that line. And again, the same thing here. It's all a bit trashed. can imagine maybe like, again, there would be a pathway kind of over here. And here in the background. So again, this is part of these buildings here. Again, there might be pathways, right, leading off. Maybe there was a building over here. Maybe it's kind of collapsed. Maybe we could sort of tell that story, put some sort of collapsed stuff there. The thing is, you got to put something everywhere, right? And it's just a matter of like having an idea about what it is and what you're going to put there. It doesn't even matter whether it makes sense, right? In my view, you can kind of just put stuff in there and make it up. The key is like, it kind of feels like you have a plan, and you're not sort of doing that panic sort of drawing where it's just kind of complete scribbles and complete nonsense. I think as long as you do that, then most of the time people will kind of look at it and just sort of think that it's interesting. It just kind of feels like, yeah, there's something there. Doesn't really matter what it is quite so much. So we had, again, like a sort of house / building here. And then we had sort of some sort of thing here. Again, the idea is this is sort of some other kind of terrace or something. Walkways, different levels. Again, if we can kind of, create that parallax, shapes, overlapping shapes, it will always give us something kind of interesting. All right, so we got one sort of towery thing here coming from this one. Let's expand that out. Yeah, see, I can't go in because that thing's there. Maybe again, just make that a bit smaller. That's what we got there. So let's pull this in. Maybe duck this in, just because it's kind of, again, just creating shapes, interesting shapes. That goes in there. Right. And put in some more of these types of windows. Now, in this case, again, how big is a person? I guess that's the question. Like maybe that big. That's kind of what I'm thinking. So if we sort of transfer that over, right, like how big, again, maybe there'd be a person here. Just going to adjust all those spaces. Subsequently. again, this is the kind of stuff you, after you've been doing this for ages, these are the kind of things you think about. It seems like it's really boring, but if you mess up any of that stuff, it just becomes an absolute nightmare. Like if you mess up the scale and you're like, oh, so this is how big someone needs to be, and then you've sort of drawn a building where, again, a person's going to be that big over there, and then it kind of like just doesn't make sense. And then you don't have the right sort of depth. Yeah, that it's very, very, very annoying. Because then you sort of got to fix it and find some way to make it not completely suck. And I do think that stuff is important, right? It's not going to make or break it, but it's those sort of things that you're likely to kind of look at and just instinctively go, oh yeah, you can instantly sort of start to see yourself walking around it a bit. So again, that's where this character is, right? Then they walk through here, so yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of right. I think that's kind of right. Have another little archway thingy here. Building here. Again, door. Door. Yeah, actually, I mean, if we look at over here, right, someone's going to be a little bit smaller. I think that might kind of work, but let's raise this up a bit. All right, so yeah, let me know if you got any questions in the chat. We might take a quick break in a minute for sort of 5 minutes, and after that we'll sort of get going again. But yeah, mostly you just need to kind of like sit back and take another look at it. It's really easy to get blind to this type of thing. So that's why, again, I keep zooming out. But I feel like, once I've added all that stuff, I do feel like it's starting to have the level of complexity that we need. And again, that's going to give me some guidance for what to do in the foreground, right, to add that detail. Once I've kind of set this, it sort of means like, right, that's how much detail there is in the world. And then as we sort of travel back here, this gives us a much better idea there. So yeah, but let's take a quick break, and yeah, let me know if you guys have got questions about the process or other art things. And yeah, we'll dive in when we get back. Cool. All right. So back, I'm just going to keep drawing. Now, I feel like, again, most of this is probably done, right? I feel like I can make up a lot of this as we go. And what I'm going to do is just plan for the major overlaps. So I don't need to like finesse all of the subtlety of every tree, but I am going to think about the design of it. Where are different bits and pieces in terms of, and so, you know, having a little bit of stuff over here, you know, maybe a little bit of stuff over there, and just that'll allow me to kind of have a first pass at it. And just step back and see, hey, you know, is any of this right or wrong? Again, you know, want to make sure that I've got these sort of tangents working. Not quite sure about that. Yeah, I feel like something more like that is going to be better. So that's the basic idea. And yeah, maybe we can play around with a few rock areas there. Again, you know, this is where it's good to experiment. It's much better to experiment here when we're doing this stuff than it is to do the same thing, you know, in the final. Because it just means we can be a lot rougher in the final if we know where stuff should go. If we're, you know, worrying too much about two things at once, like, you know, where does stuff go and how do I draw it, then that's when stuff often starts to go pear-shaped. So we can also show that depth story by, you know, having some, you know, sort of rocky areas here and some different areas of trees, and just use that to show the scale as they go, you know, smaller and smaller as they get to the background. Again, there's got to be something there. You know, when I sketched it in, it was like, this is all just flat. Well, yeah, I mean, compared to everything else, it's flat, but now everything else is pretty, you know, pretty detailed. Now, one of the things I am going to play around with is I'm going to sort of think about this line following through here. And bang, I can see, yeah, I might actually be able to see that sort of depth over there if I play that right. And that will actually be a really important thing to do to show the continuity where everything goes. Just this leading line going all the way through. So here's where, again, might be good to get some reference for these types of cliffs and, you know, how the trees and those sorts of things interact with it. Yeah, I don't really have a lot of imagery on hand in my head about, you know, exactly how that stuff works. So again, can be good to just have a go, see what happens. Yeah. And again, most of this is just about designing overlaps, right? We're designing the overlaps for the character Make sure everything fits okay. Make sure there's some interesting different colors. So again, we'll probably have the trees will be green, the rocks will be a slightly different color. Could have some of them on separate layers. So yeah, if we think about all these things, it'll just give us something to put there. Now in the final grade, right, like most of this will probably just look the same. But because there's a bit of detail there and thought put into it, it means that it'll look like sort of sensible sort of noise back there, as opposed to kind of just maybe too empty. So we can visually make it empty, but we don't want it to actually be empty. So again, thinking about different shapes on different planes, foreground, middle ground, background. And again, I want to leave most of that pretty sort of empty there, sort of encapsulate the characters. So how do these shapes interact? And this is where, again, might be good to, delete some of these things, move them around. Again, this is what you would call micro composition, figuring out all of those little subtle things, the small little bits and pieces. We got the overall composition, but then we've got this, right? How do I arrange these little blobs of tree and foliage up here? How do I make this interesting? How do I arrange the difference between little bits of foliage here and the rock, right? So we have grass, similar to what I was saying down here last week. We've basically got like 3 or 4 different types of foliage, and it's just a matter of arranging them in an interesting way. If we do that, we win. We win the battle. If it's confusing, not visually pleasing, then we lose the battle. And again, it's not the end of the world. It's just that, you'd probably just be looking at it a year later and be like, God damn it, why didn't I fix that? That's normally the difference. So, if we zoom out, or we'll get to like a decent sort of zoom and hide that. So that's sort of what we had. Right, this is kind of what we've added. And yeah, I mean, I feel like that's more interesting than what we had there. And I feel like that's going to sort of work from a scale perspective. So again, I'm not going to go all the way to 3 today, but because and again, we'll skip streaming on Thursday this week because I got some things that are sort of urgent and need doing. But we'll continue on next week. So we'll do next Tuesday, next Thursday, and hopefully, if we can manage that, and start to finish this off. Now, again, probably what I'll do is I might sort of go through and do some of that finessing in my own time, because a lot of it is just kind of, redoing things and just worrying about, again, those sort of micro compositions, just sort of pushing the imagery and working that stuff as much as we can. And again, depending on the And so then again on the next session we might come back and actually think about doing some finished lines maybe. But yeah, so this is essentially how you do this. If you need more detail because this is, the cover of something important, then you keep going. You know what I mean? You keep fiddling with it. You finesse all those micro compositions. You make sure it's all right. You double, triple check everything. You go through it with a fine-tooth comb. And that means when you do the finished lines, you can really just focus on making the finished lines clean. Then it looks more polished. If you need to go, you're just like, oh man, this not getting paid to spend 80 hours on this, then you sort of just make some of it up, and sometimes it turns out well, and sometimes it doesn't quite get there, but maybe there's a few little bits and pieces here. So it's all a matter of perfecting those bits and pieces and deciding how much detail. And as a general rule, if you do need it to be a cover-worthy image, and it's going to take a few weeks of solid work, then that does take a lot longer. It's not like we could probably do the whole thing in 10 hours if we wanted. We could, and then if we added another 10 hours on top of that, you wouldn't get a drastically different or better image, but it would hold up to more scrutiny. When you zoom in, you'd be like, oh yeah, that's there's some sort of stuff there. And again, that's not necessarily better or worse. That's just often, that is what it is, right? Sometimes it looks and feels better if it's a bit looser, but in this case, we need the detail anyway. Cool. So How Are You says, hi Tim, you inspired me to become a member of AVFX. Hope all is well. I'm glad that is the case. Hopefully that is working out well for you. Awesome. Yeah, and so again, it's just a matter of just going through and we could probably make some of this stuff up in the inking phase if we want. We could be a little bit sketchier with it. None of this is sort of important, but when you're doing this for the first few times, right? So again, I've done this enough times that I can probably wing it a little bit, but the first few times I go through and have to figure all these things out, you just can go and the first few times I did it, I spent a lot of time just redrawing those things, redrawing the arrangement of the leaves, redrawing the pattern of the rock cracks, from a design point of view. Just be like, does this make sense, right? Is this where rock cracks would go? Secondly, does that look interesting? Is it, think about it, the abstract nature of the image. And the best way to explain that I think Craig Mullins explained this to me ages ago on an internet forum, not to me specifically, but as a concept that he was talking about that really made sense is the abstract nature of the image is, if you turn it upside down, does it still look good, right? So we're not thinking about right, if you sort of look at it like this, does it look interesting? Do we have a nice balance of stuff, right? Do we have busy stuff here? Do we have a nice arrangement of lines? Do they kind of feel random? Because those cracks, they kind of got to feel random and not random at the same time, because there's logic to it, right? Rocks crack in particular ways, but then if we make them crack in a particular way, then we can show the form better. So that's where, you kind of have some of these where I'm actually potentially using some of the cracks in the rocks to kind of show, well, this is how the form's moving. Hey, Pete, how you doing? This is how the form is moving. And so I'm using it to help me with the image. And, secondly is like, well, if I get the rock cracks right, it makes it feel more like a rock. So it tells the story. And then there's the layer of, but do the rock cracks look interesting? Are they abstractly interesting? Are they nice to look at? And so that, I guess, is the sort of thing you're doing as you finesse that, what I describe as a tertiary level of detail. So primary forms and primary detail is like, right, what you would kind of have here. It's like, here's a big block. Here's another block. These are all sort of primary forms. These are our geoforms. And then we've got sort of the secondary forms, which would be like, for the characters and for this, it's like, let's break this up into, a giant pile of triangles, right? It was just kind of one big, triangle. Now let's make it into like a whole pile more. Let's add some more stuff to it. And the tertiary level of detail is kind of like, let's draw the roof tiles. And the micro composition element of that is, let's make sure the way that we represent and draw those roof tiles is interesting. Same thing with the foliage. It's sort of, I've got to put the foliage in there, but it's, on the one hand, it's a job you have to do. On another hand, it's an abstract exercise that you sort of engage in. And that's sort of what I'm doing, as I'm sort of going through here and thinking like, what's happening? What am I doing? Where do I want this leaf to be? There's a logic to it, and there's stuff to do. And I think that is, in many ways, it's not necessarily, oh, that's a good thing to do. It's just, I think that's the only thing you can do to make sure you have the patience to survive going through and redrawing all these stupid leaves again. Otherwise, you just go nuts, right? There's no like, yeah, it's the same in the same way that, we have to sort of think about who's living in the buildings, because otherwise, what are you doing? You're just sort of looking at reference or doing that. It's sort of not fun. Whereas if I'm sitting here thinking about like, what if I was a little character like walking down here? That would be interesting. And I'm walking down here, and I'm walking down here. And what if I was walking over here? I climbed up here. So the kind of thinking about it is sort of necessary, both because that, I guess, makes it better, but also it sort of stops you going nuts, doing really boring stuff like, drawing rooftops again and again and again. It's like, how many silly rooftops did I draw? How many pathways did I draw? That's all really boring, and unless you're interested in it. And the same way, all these details are just deadly boring. Unless you're trying to do something with it, right? Unless you're trying to kind of balance all these areas at once and think about that complexity and have something to aim for, where I sort of, I'm making these marks, and then I sort of think, no, that's not the right mark. That's not the right silly crack to put in there. And I guess it's that sort of thing that makes the difference between, like, when I really sucked at putting detail in, is I just couldn't get emotionally involved in it. I'd just be like, I'm really sick of drawing these cracks in the rock. And so what I do is kind of just like draw, you just turn off your brain and you just draw like a million cracks, and it just doesn't look good. It's just not as visually interesting. And you can't relate it to other stuff. So it's not, you're not learning stuff. Whereas again, if we can relate this to the concepts of abstract design, then potentially we are learning things, right? We're increasing our ability to perceive, just sort of visual interest and work towards that. Yeah. Anyway, that's what I'm doing as I'm redrawing a million leaves. But that's also why, I'll probably do it maybe in a bit of spare time, because it's pretty boring to watch. It's sort of interesting if you're approaching it the right way, but you know, after I've kind of said that spiel, it's like, yep. So now I'm going to go and do that. Think about it. So again, doing some stuff here, and I'm looking at it on the monitor up there at the same time, and that gives me a lot of stuff to go on. And that's why, again, some of these marks seem very abstract, right? They're not really the best drawing of a rock, but that's because part of what I'm trying to do is understand like the design language of those cracks and whether that's interesting, and then to figure out ways to suggest that, because you know, if we go through and sort of render all of the cracks and, you know, do all of that in detail, it will take away from that main image. So anyway, that's the general idea. And, you know, I guess from a compositional standpoint, we do want to kind of have a little bit more detail over here, because, you know, we want our eye to be drawn a little bit more over there. And in the same way, right, we're going to make some sort of focal areas out of these. And it's important to think about, again, like, you know, sometimes I just get sort of lazy and I think about, you know, these leaves as if they're kind of just, you know, they're all these kind of flat objects. I guess that's something I could work on. You know, because obviously leaves have relationships to the light. You know, they're not all just kind of, you know, they're not randomly placed. And there's very few leaves like sticking up like that, right? They're all trying to say, get me sunlight, get me. So again, trying to finesse some of this stuff here. Let's try and apply some of that logic I was talking about there. Leaves not just sticking up in the air for no reason. Again, overlapping shapes. Make sure the tangents are working, etc., etc. And here again, we could, you know, depends how much time we got. This is the kind of thing where, yeah, you know, you figure out how much time you've got. But I could, you know, put some tiles on here, for instance. Let's divide that up. 1, 2, something like that. But super important if you try that sort of stuff to zoom out and see, like, is that better? Is that something that's interesting? Yeah, let's, here again, we could try and make some of these bits a little bit more sort of structural, a little bit more interesting. You know, when people really go to town on these little decorative things, you know, sometimes in some of these civilizations, people put a lot of effort and time. So again, I'm not sure whether this is going to interfere with the pot, but I mean, maybe the pot is kind of part of the, you know, maybe it's part of the structure, you know, maybe it's sort of, hard to know whether that's going to be like interesting or not. Imagine this is kind of some, again, where's that perspective? Coming that way, that way, that way, something like that. Again, this is just an idea. This could easily turn out sort of terribly, and this will be a huge pain to mirror over. But it will make all of the the rest of the stuff that we do here very easy, because there'll be something there that's sort of structural, and yeah, won't have to worry about you know, trying to make something boring be kind of all rendered. So I don't know. I'm going to think about that. Like, is that too much? Is that going to require us to, because you can see it's like, that's not actually that well drawn. That like needs to be, right? Like that's kind of the center. So we need to move that over. We just do that roughly, right? It kind of needs to be like that. So maybe it could just be like no tiles on there. Just be like some sort of structure there that's kind of holding it. So yeah, so this is the sort of stuff you wouldn't do if you didn't have, you know, heaps of time to do it, and if you didn't know that, you know, you might be looking at it ages going, what is that? Why didn't I put some actual, like, why did I design that in such a boring way? So this is, again, just experimenting with the idea of putting a bit more thought into it. But this automatically just gives us better silhouettes. You know, it gives us probably maybe the focus we need there. I think it's just a matter of, you know, thinking about like, well, maybe we do need a bit more detail in these areas. Maybe that will, maybe that'll add what we need. Get some kind of tiles, something like that. And again, that way, one of the things we can do is kind of have some of those tiles, right, fall into the ground. Gives us something to do there. Now, none of this matters if, you know, until now, right, until we're thinking about it, right, until we're at this phase where now it's time to think about all of the boring, where does the grass go and what is happening here, and, you know, all this kind of little subtlety. But, you know, if I can kind of put, you can see that like now there is something there, whereas this kind of just looks like primary and secondary form exploration. There's no, it's like, what's that made of? Like, well, you know, if you're just sketching around and sort of concepting it a bit, it doesn't matter, you know. But if we're going to try and make it into something, then it kind of does matter, right? So, like, is it worth playing around with that, or is that too much? Is that too much nonsense? Don't. Like, maybe not. I mean, it certainly makes it feel like, you know, there's more stuff going on. Or is it just going to look like it's a bit silly? Maybe that can be kind of cut out. I don't know. So if we take that out, just doing back, and then we'll sort of check it. Like, do we need that? No, I don't think we need that. So again, that's probably a bit too far. Don't need that much. But again, I can start to think about using the same sort of cracks that I've got everywhere else. And again, try and sort of tell that story of the form changing, right? So I've got a plane here, right? And then it sort of changes direction. So what I want is I want the cracks to kind of change direction as they move around. That's the basic idea. And yeah, so all we do now is basically, you know, do that same sort of thing, but with everything. Just go through, finesse it, think about shape design. Is it interesting enough? Does it have enough detail? What can we do to add that detail if it doesn't, right? Keep going, keep going. And eventually you either run out of time or you get sick of it, right? Whichever I guess is most important. And then you move on to the next phase. But the more you do at this stage, the easier it is to kind of make this stuff up. So, you know, it's not like it's just always a major option for the beginning artist to kind of just say, oh, well, I'm just going to put in my primary forms and then I'll figure out secondary and tertiary forms as I'm doing the, you know, sort of inking. That is something that, you know, takes a while to learn. And the way you learn it is experimenting here, having a, you know, playing around with different options, different things. Again, doing what I'm doing, erasing, experimenting with different levels of, you know, cracking or drawing leaves or whatever it is. And you just build networks in your mind for, you know, how those things are likely to work, and, you know, just experience. You build your visual library for that stuff, and then eventually you can kind of sort of make a lot of it up as you go. And that's, yeah. And especially if you're working on a book or a large project, you do the same things again and again. Yeah, just keep going. And yeah, as I said, the more detailed the project needs to be, just based on, you know, the finished level of product, the more you probably want to do this stuff beforehand. It'll often save you a lot of time to do as much stuff as you can. At this phase, if you wait and try and wing it, A, it can be stressful, and B, you can actually spend more time worrying about that at the end than if you kind of just, you know, relax and go through at this phase. So again, a lot of the reason for repeating that you would see in the line and color sort of style, where we just repeat, is that it's very relaxing, right? The process takes care of a lot of the exploration. I can play with all these concepts. You know, I can redo this a million times. It's got nothing to do with the finished product so far. And it's actually a really good style and technique for experimenting and understanding how these things kind of relate to each other. The downside of it is we don't see the color yet, you know, so I don't really know how any of this is going to turn out. You need to experiment with that as well. But yeah, just from a basic working as a professional artist and just being able to kind of sit here and noodle leaves and erase them and unerase them and figure out what's working. Again, it's redundant, but it's very relaxing, and you know that you'll be able to get a highly finished result if you just kind of keep pushing and keep sort of working and refining all these little bits and pieces. So, and it also means that the inking process then will also be quite relaxing, because we're just sort of repeating things that we've done. But in that case, we're just going to be focusing on making the lines clean and simple and effective, for optimizing the textures, thinking about different, different approaches to the surface of the painting with line. So yeah, not sure whether I'm going to give this line tail that kind of graphic look, right? Or maybe I should, do something else. Not sure yet. Haven't quite got there. But as I said before, these little micro compositions, figuring out like how the line's tail overlaps, these are quite important. Right. And again, if you just figure them all out now, then the rest of it will kind of take care of itself. But anyway, I think that's probably all we've got for today. And again, what did we get done? We drew a background. See if we can get the previous version that we started with. I'll open that up. So that's kind of where we started. Whoop. Come on, Photoshop. Yeah, it's pretty big. Starting to chug. That's sort of where we started. That's sort of where we ended. Here's where, see if we can copy that, put it here. Bam, there we go. Now we can look at it and track our progress, which is important, especially if you're chipping away at these things. Right, that's kind of what we did. So yeah, it's going okay, working well. As I said, next session, I'll probably keep doing some of this stuff, right? Like keep noodling away at the background, repeat some of that stuff over there. Again, just keep fiddling around with the foreground rocks and, draw out the leaves and maybe look at a little bit of reference for, how those different foliage could actually look, where the leaves are positioned, etc., etc. I feel like this line needs another pass. So just sort of go through and do that and get it to a point where, that the inking is just going to be a matter of putting in final lines. I think that's probably the safest thing. I could make some of it up, but yeah, I feel like there's probably enough here that it's worthwhile doing. Mostly to make sure that the hierarchy of detail is good. That's really the key, because I think that will make the image work in the end. But anyway, thanks for hanging out. We'll catch you next week on Tuesday. I think that's where we'll start. Again, skip Thursday this week, and we'll come back on, again, same time next week. We'll see you then.